And moving on to West Africa now, the deportations, Burkina Faso's military government said the US proposal is indecent and runs completely contrary to the principle of human dignity. Since Trump's return to the White House, his administration has struck several migration deals, deporting people to third countries, often to nations with which they have no connection.
The planes were ready. Their engines rumbled at a U.S. Air Force base in Texas, filled with men and women from every corner of the world, people stripped of their papers, their hopes, their second chances. The destination stamped on their deportation orders, Africa. But on a quiet evening in Ouagadougou, a single message stopped the flight. Burkina Faso will not receive anyone deported under these terms. It is against the principle of human dignity. And with that, one of the smallest nations on earth said no, not just to Washington, not just to President Donald Trump's migration policy, but to a system that for decades treated Africa like the world's disposal site. This was not a rebellion of weapons. It was a rebellion of values. When the U.S. Embassy retaliated, suspending all visa services for Burkina Faso citizens, Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't bow. He didn't apologize. He looked straight into the camera and said, "We may be poor, but we are not for sale." That moment echoed across the continent. In Ghana, Uganda, Eswatini, where governments had quietly accepted U.S. deportation deals, people began to ask, why didn't our leaders say no? Because in that defiant silence from Ouagadougou, something powerful was reborn, the belief that Africa's dignity is not negotiable. So tonight we ask, what made this young Burkina Faso leader stand his ground when others stayed silent? And what does his decision reveal about the future of Africa's sovereignty in a world driven by power and fear? If you believe that dignity matters more than diplomacy, stay with us. Please share this story if you stand among those who support President Ibrahim Traoré's vision for an Africa that cannot be bought. And subscribe because the truth about Africa's awakening deserves to be heard, not hidden. It started quietly, a simple diplomatic note almost invisible to the world's headlines. The United States had just expanded its new global deportation program, a policy personally championed by President Donald J. Trump after his return to the White House. The plan was brutal in its efficiency: send tens of thousands of undocumented migrants back to their regions of origin. If their home country refused, Washington would pay another African nation to take them. Rwanda said yes. So did Ghana, Eswatini, Uganda, and South Sudan. For each accepted flight, millions in U.S. development assistance would follow. To many governments struggling with debt and unemployment, it seemed like a necessary deal, cynical perhaps, but politically convenient. Then came Burkina Faso, a small landlocked country at the heart of the Sahel. No sea, no oil, no power. Yet, when the U.S. Department of Homeland Security sent its proposal, the response from Ouagadougou came swiftly and firmly. The proposal is indecent. It violates the dignity of the African people. In one sentence, the Burkina Faso government turned down a deal worth over $42 million in aid and infrastructure funding. That rejection stunned Washington. Within 48 hours, the U.S. Embassy in Ouagadougou announced that it would suspend all regular visa services for Burkina Faso citizens. From now on, they would need to travel to Lomé, Togo, to apply a clear act of pressure disguised as bureaucracy. For most African leaders, that would have been enough to force a reversal. But not for Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Since taking power in 2022, Traoré had built his leadership on two unshakable pillars: sovereignty and dignity. He had expelled French troops, closed foreign military bases, and replaced Western contracts with African and Eurasian partnerships. When he heard that Washington was now threatening to blacklist Burkina Faso from its visa program, he didn't flinch. Instead, the government issued a second, even sharper statement: Burkina Faso will not serve as a landfill for deported migrants. Every nation must bear responsibility for its own citizens. Across Africa, this was unheard of. For decades, the continent had accepted whatever the great powers demanded, from trade terms to military cooperation to immigration control. But this time, a young captain from Ouagadougou had said no. The news spread like wildfire. In markets, cafes, and online forums, Burkina Faso citizens discussed the announcement with pride. Taxi drivers replayed the clip of Traoré's speech on their phones, murmuring, "He speaks like Sankara." On social media, the hashtag #Traoré says no began trending across Africa, followed by Yubi Africa is not a dump, a phrase that captured more than anger. It captured awakening. Meanwhile, the United States tried to minimize the story. State Department briefings framed Burkina Faso's decision as regrettable but insignificant. Yet behind closed doors, U.S. officials worried. Because this wasn't just about deportations, it was about defiance. If one small nation could stand up to Washington, others might follow. And soon they did. Nigeria, Africa's largest democracy, issued a similar statement refusing to accept third-country deportees from the U.S., calling the policy coercive and inhumane. Suddenly, the question wasn't about immigration anymore. It was about whether Africa would continue to trade its moral voice for aid money. For ordinary Burkina Faso citizens, the answer was already clear. A shopkeeper in Ouagadougou said it best in a local interview, "Let them keep their visas. We have our dignity." That single sentence captured what this moment truly meant, not defiance for its own sake, but a quiet declaration that Africa will no longer be bought, pressured, or humiliated. From that day forward, Burkina Faso's refusal became more than a diplomatic story. It became a symbol, a message that rippled through every capital in Africa that even without money or might, a people who defend their dignity can still stand taller than the powerful. The world learned about Burkina Faso's defiance not through diplomatic cables, but through a single clip that went viral overnight. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, dressed in his plain brown uniform, stood before a row of microphones. No teleprompter, no flag display, just his voice. "We will not accept human beings as cargo. We will not trade dignity for aid." Those 20 words tore through the silence of the global news cycle like thunder. Western media outlets CNN, BBC, Reuters scrambled to confirm the statement. In Washington, State Department spokespeople appeared uncomfortable, insisting the U.S. respected Burkina Faso's right to make its own decisions while quietly warning of consequences. But in Ouagadougou, something extraordinary happened. Crowds began to gather in the city's Independence Square. Young and old students, veterans, mothers with children holding handwritten signs. "We are not for sale. Dignity has no price." Local radio stations looped his words again and again. Across the Sahel, people called him the voice we have been waiting for. For many Africans, this was not just politics, it was vindication. For too long, they had seen their leaders bow to foreign powers under the banner of cooperation. They had watched deportation flights land in African cities under the cover of night, delivering men and women with no connection to the countries receiving them. But now, a single act of refusal had pierced the illusion of inevitability. The emotional peak came when France 24 aired a split-screen broadcast on one side Traoré's speech, on the other, a U.S. military cargo plane preparing to take off. The contrast was haunting. A young African soldier speaking of dignity and a superpower preparing to discard people like broken tools. Across Africa, solidarity spread like wildfire. In Nigeria, students marched through the streets of Abuja chanting, "We stand with Burkina Faso." In Accra, human rights lawyers filed lawsuits against Ghana's government for signing the deportation deal. And in Bamako and Niamey, murals of Captain Traoré appeared overnight, painted with a single word beneath his image: dignity. But not everyone was cheering. In European capitals, diplomats whispered about a troubling populist wave. Washington insiders branded Traoré as a destabilizing figure aligned with Russia. The Pentagon reportedly reassessed its security cooperation programs in the Sahel, fearing that this moral rebellion could evolve into a geopolitical one. Yet even as criticism grew, something deeper was unfolding. African commentators, pastors, and community elders began to describe this as the second liberation, not from colonial armies, but from moral subservience. For the first time in decades, Africa was debating not just who rules, but what is right. Meanwhile, in the United States, the reaction was divided. Mainstream outlets dismissed the story as symbolic. But independent media, faith groups, and immigrant rights activists began to highlight Traoré's words as a moral mirror to America's conscience. On social media, African-American communities shared the clip under hashtags like #JetterRespectAfrica and No Human Cargo, drawing parallels between the deportation policy and the history of the slave trade. In churches from Chicago to Atlanta, pastors quoted Traoré's statement during Sunday sermons, "We will not accept human beings as cargo." To them, it wasn't politics, it was prophecy. As for Traoré himself, he stayed silent for days after the speech. When a journalist finally asked him if he feared American sanctions, his reply was simple: "A nation that fears doing what is right is already colonized." That quote became the defining line of the moment. It was no longer about deportations. It was about Africa's soul and whether it would continue to live under the weight of power or rise under the light of principle. By the end of that week, what began as a bureaucratic standoff had turned into something far greater, a spiritual rebellion led not by weapons or wealth, but by a single sentence that refused to compromise. When the chants faded and the rallies ended, Burkina Faso woke up to the quiet weight of its decision. Visa offices were shuttered. American aid projects, small schools, sanitation programs, agricultural funds were suddenly under review. On the streets of Ouagadougou, life went on. But something invisible had changed. At first, fear spread. Students who had planned to study in the United States found their visa appointments canceled overnight. Families that relied on U.S.-funded food assistance wondered what would happen next. Government economists warned that the country could lose millions in foreign aid. But then came an unexpected response: solidarity. Within weeks, local communities began organizing to fill the gaps. Churches, mosques, and cooperatives collected food and books for students affected by the suspension. The government announced a new program called Dignité d'abord Dignity, first offering scholarships for Burkina Faso youth to study in neighboring African nations instead. The shift was more than symbolic. For the first time, ordinary citizens began to speak of self-reliance not as a dream, but as necessity. One teacher in Koudougou put it simply, "If they close one door, we'll build our own." Inside government halls, the decision had also sparked a new kind of politics. Ministers debated whether to reduce dependency on Western donors altogether. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs drafted an ambitious plan for African migration partnerships, seeking agreements with Algeria, South Africa, and even Russia, not for deportations, but for skills exchange and youth employment. Meanwhile, across the region, the ripple effect continued. In Mali and Niger, officials praised Burkina Faso's courage. The three countries already united in the Alliance of Sahel States (IS) began discussing a common migration policy built on mutual respect and continental dignity. It was the first time in modern history that African nations had openly coordinated to resist Western migration pressure. But not all the consequences were diplomatic. In the United States, the State Department quietly downgraded Burkina Faso's cooperation index. Western analysts predicted economic collapse, yet the opposite began to happen. Local industries long ignored suddenly received a surge of national pride and investment. Small textile factories reopened. Youth cooperatives launched crowdfunding campaigns titled "Our Hands, Our Future." Even farmers once reliant on U.S. fertilizers started producing local alternatives with government support. Still, the challenges were real. The economy tightened. Prices rose. Some urban elites criticized Traoré for provoking isolation, but among the poor and the working class, support for him only grew stronger. They called him Le Capitaine du Peuple, the people's captain. By the end of the year, the political landscape of Burkina Faso had transformed. The parliament, once divided along party lines, passed a new law of dignity, making it illegal for any future government to accept deportation or repatriation deals without national consultation. It was more than legislation. It was a statement to history. No Burkina Faso soil will be used to discard the unwanted of another nation. Through hardship, Burkina Faso had rediscovered its voice. Through sanctions, it had redefined its strength. What began as a simple no had evolved into a civic awakening, one that reminded a weary continent that sovereignty was not just about borders or armies, but about the courage to defend human worth. From Washington's perspective, it was supposed to be a minor headline, another developing country refusing a bilateral deal. But within weeks, the Burkina Faso refusal had become something else entirely, a mirror held up to the conscience of the West. Inside the White House, advisors debated how to respond. Should they punish? Should they ignore? The dilemma was awkward. How could the United States, a nation that once championed human rights, justify cutting off aid to a government that rejected the idea of treating human beings as cargo? Mainstream media outlets tried to frame the story as anti-American posturing. Yet the narrative slipped away from them. Independent journalists began to ask uncomfortable questions. If America insists on exporting its unwanted people, what does that say about the values it claims to defend? In academic circles, a quiet conversation began. Scholars of international law compared Trump's deportation plan to Cold War dumping agreements when powerful nations shifted unwanted burdens to weaker allies. Editorials in The Guardian and Le Monde cautiously acknowledged that Burkina Faso's stance carried moral weight far beyond its borders. Meanwhile, faith-based organizations in the U.S. and Europe, Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, released statements praising President Ibrahim Traoré's decision as a moral act in defense of human dignity. A bishop in Chicago declared during Mass, "When the powerful forget compassion, it is often the poor who remind us what it means to be human." This shift in tone unsettled Washington more than any sanction could. Because what Traoré had done was not political rebellion, it was moral rebellion. He had redefined what it meant to stand up to power, not through threats or weapons, but through principle. In Europe, reactions were mixed. France, long estranged from Traoré's government, accused Burkina Faso of aligning with foreign interests, a thinly veiled reference to Russia. But other European voices, particularly in Germany and the Netherlands, began quietly urging the EU to rethink migration ethics. At the United Nations, Burkina Faso's ambassador delivered a speech that silenced the hall. "Africa is not asking for sympathy. We are asking for fairness. No nation should be asked to bear another's shame." The applause lasted nearly a minute, a rare occurrence in a chamber usually ruled by diplomacy, not emotion. Across Africa, the message resonated deeply. Newspapers in Nigeria called Traoré's defiance the rebirth of African moral leadership. South African commentators described it as the Sankara moment of a new generation. Even in Latin America, activists began citing Burkina Faso as an example of ethical sovereignty, the courage to make moral choices in a world dominated by power politics. For the United States, this was more than an embarrassment, it was a wake-up call. Burkina Faso's defiance had forced Washington to confront a question it rarely asked itself anymore. Can a nation still claim moral authority if it punishes those who choose compassion? By the end of that year, one thing was clear. This was not just about deportation flights or migration policy. It was about something older, deeper, and more enduring: the battle between conscience and convenience. And in that battle, one of the poorest nations on earth had managed to humble the richest, not with force, but with integrity. When the dust settled and the headlines faded, what remained was not a scandal, it was a statement. A poor, landlocked nation had looked into the eyes of the world's greatest power and said, "We are not afraid to be human." That sentence now lives beyond Burkina Faso. It has become a quiet anthem across Africa, whispered in classrooms, echoed in churches, and painted on walls: dignity first. But with every act of courage comes a warning. History shows that those who challenge power on moral grounds rarely walk an easy path. Thomas Sankara did not. Patrice Lumumba did not. And today, Ibrahim Traoré stands where they once stood, facing pressure, isolation, and the possibility of being erased not by violence but by silence. Because the greatest danger for a leader like him is not assassination, it's indifference. When the world grows used to injustice, when compassion becomes inconvenient, dignity becomes a crime. So what happens next? Burkina Faso's stand has opened a question that the world can no longer ignore. Can global politics survive without moral conviction? For the people of Burkina Faso, the answer is already clear. They are planting seeds of independence, economic, cultural, spiritual, even when the soil is dry and the storms are many. They are teaching their children that sovereignty is not about size or wealth, but about the courage to do what is right when no one else will. And perhaps that is why this moment matters, not because it changed policy, but because it restored something even greater: belief. Belief that the small can be strong, that the forgotten can still lead, that in a world obsessed with profit and politics, one young African captain could remind humanity that dignity is still sacred. So tonight, ask yourself, do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's stand for human dignity is the beginning of a new African revolution? Or will the world once again turn away and let the powerful decide who deserves compassion? If you believe that the truth still matters, that human worth cannot be negotiated, share this story. Share it for the people who said no when it was hardest to say it. Share it for the Africa that refuses to be forgotten. And subscribe, because the next chapter of this awakening has already begun.